Yo, what's up guys, welcome back to another video. This is a reaction to 13 dangers kids totally ignored in the 1970s. The world's changed and I guess kids in the 1970s were allowed to do things that kids growing up now, or when I grew up like 15 years ago, 15 years ago, I wouldn't have even thought would be possible. I don't know what sort of things it will go into, but maybe it was just health and safety with like silly things like that. But we're going to check this out and see, because I don't truly know what's going to be in this video. But yeah, hopefully going to enjoy. Hopefully this is a nice little throwback for some of you who maybe grew up in this era. And yeah, let's see some of these dangers that I guess kids nowadays won't ever experience. Probably for good, maybe for bad, but I'd say probably for good.
Growing up in the 1970s was an adventurous and carefree time where kids still had plenty of freedom. They explored, played, and took risks that would make some people cringe today. Safety certainly wasn't the top priority, but these daring activities did leave us with an independent spirit, and the memories still bring a smile to those who lived through it. So let's take a look back at the dangers kids ignored in the 1970s. In the 1970s, kids still spent quite a bit of time around train tracks. If they weren't placing pennies on the tracks, they might be found hurling rocks at passing trains, or using the rails as a balance beam.
Jeez.
Walking along the tracks was common, and making it across a trestle was an adventure.
I'm assuming there's definitely cases where this went wrong for the kids, or for kids on the tracks. That is mad.
For many kids. Despite the dangers, kids would dare each other to keep going, even when they heard the distant rumble of a train.
Mental.
The narrow trestles, which sometimes stretched over deep ravines, added to the thrill. Back then, the potential danger of falling or being hit by a train was a real fear, but some kids still worked up the courage to accept the challenge. Having a BB gun was a regular pastime in the 1970s. Target practice was usually an old soda can, and carrying them around the neighborhood was commonplace. Many kids...
I had friends who had BB guns, but I was never allowed to have one myself. So when I grew up, BB guns were still somewhat a thing. I don't think they were probably as common as maybe they were in the 70s, 80s, 90s and stuff, but they were definitely a thing. I know I had a few friends that had them, and I was always like jealous, because I wasn't allowed one myself. I'd probably be stuck with a water gun or something. In the summer, not in the winter, but yeah, I never had one, but these were definitely a thing when I grew up.
Would also have BB gun fights with their friends. In the 1970s...
Fair. BB gun fights, I don't know if we had those, to be honest, because I never had one. I've definitely been shot by a BB gun, but I don't think we had BB gun fights. That seems a bit crazy. I don't know how hard they shoot them. Maybe they're not actually that hard at all. I can't remember.
Shot by a BB was a badge of honor, and no adults were around to tell them to stop. Getting hit on your bare skin would leave a good-sized welt, but it would heal and not stop you from doing it again. Sure, BBs could ricochet and hit someone in the face or eye, but that was just an acceptable risk. In those days, everyone, including parents, seemed to have a much higher tolerance for danger. Exploring abandoned buildings or sneaking onto construction sites was a classic 1970s activity. Kids were outside constantly and would fill their day with all sorts of adventures, including climbing over rusty nails, broken glass, and loose boards without giving it a second thought.
Is this London during World War II? Why is it showing this image?
The thrill of discovering an empty space and turning it into a secret clubhouse or battleground outweighed the risks of stepping on sharp objects or scraping your knee. No one really worried about it, and most parents didn't even know where their kids were spending their afternoons. The freedom to roam and make some risky choices was what growing up was all about.
Crazy. I mean, to be fair, abandoned buildings, fair enough. Everyone has that interest, if we're being honest.
Hills and giant tractor tires was the kind of wild, unpredictable fun that made the 1970s an exciting time to be a kid. You'd climb inside and let your friends push you down a steep hill.
Is this actually a thing that people done? Wait, what?
Completely out of control as the tire gained speed. It didn't matter if you crashed into a tree or rolled off into the bushes. It was all about who could stay rolling the longest. You'd of course end up dizzy and banged up, but it was all in the spirit of fun. With no helmets, no supervision, and no way to stop once the tire got going, it was a game that gave kids a shot of pure adrenaline.
And he's saying that people growing up in this era actually used to do this. This is the sort of thing they'd have in like Jackass. But this is actually just what people got up to. Flipping hell. People in this era were made of steel. They did not give a damn. If this is all actually true. Jeez.
Playgrounds in the 1970s were a whole different experience, especially with their tall, all-metal structure.
It's a very, like, prison-esque looking park, isn't it? It looks very prison-esque.
Climbing to the top of a hot metal slide or navigating the jungle gym was both thrilling and dangerous. In the summer, the metal would get scorching hot, and kids could easily get burned. And if you fell, you weren't landing on soft rubber mulch like today. There was just hard dirt or even concrete. But this didn't stop us. We would climb onto the merry-go-round just to see how much speed we could take before being thrown off. The swing sets would often lift off the ground the higher you swung, yet we would still see how far we could push it. The 1970s playground may have been the most dangerous place a kid could be, especially when you add in the inevitable dare from a friend. It certainly was an unforgettable part of childhood. Back in the 70s, as kids were roaming free, they often snacked on wild berries or sipped nectar from honeysuckle vines while playing outdoors.
What?
It was part of a carefree spirit of the time. If it looked like food, kids would try it, and so would most adults. There was always a slight chance of eating something poisonous or having an allergic reaction, but that didn't stop kids from enjoying nature's bounty. It added to the adventure of playing in the yard or exploring the neighborhood, and most kids were taught by their parents what wild plants were safe to snack on.
Fair enough.
Building a makeshift bike ramp and daring each other to jump over friends was
He mentioned this one before. This one is wild. Some of the images that he showed as well. Absolutely crazy. It's so wild. But there's images of it, so it shows people actually used to do it.
an everyday thrill for 1970s kids. The ramps were usually cobbled together from old wood, wobbly and unstable, because you had to work with what you could find. You'd see how much air you could get, with friends lying on the ground below, cheering you on. And of course there were no helmets or pads, and crashing was likely. So scraped knees and bruised egos were something that kids learned to deal with. In those days, kids lived for the adrenaline rush and the bragging rights that came with a successful jump.
Bruh.
Nothing felt freer than riding in the back of a station wagon with no seatbelts, facing the rear window, and making faces at the cars behind you. In the 1970s, it was common for families to pile into the car for long drives, and kids would often play games or nap in the back, with no worries about strapping on a seatbelt. Parents didn't think twice about it either. It was just how things were done. There were still sudden stops that sent kids flying forward, or turns that made them bump into one another, but it was all still worth it.
But that's because of the laws, wasn't it? There was no seatbelt laws. Which is actually still quite a new thing, isn't it? In the grand scheme of things. I think seatbelt laws are only, 30 years old? Maybe not even that? I could be wrong, but I think I've seen that in a previous video talking about it.
Thank you to today's sponsor.
Eat Secure in the bag as well. You'll love to see it. And plus, this is quite a good brand, isn't it? They make pre-made meals for people. It's a shame that he's in America, because I would actually try and claim this, but it would just be for Americans, but what can you do? But anyway, if you're interested, here's the codes and all that sort of stuff.
The link in the description and use code RECOLLECTION50 to get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders. That's code RECOLLECTION50 at factor75.com to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month of orders. In the 1970s, kids would willingly chase after DDT trucks as they spread pesticide through neighborhoods, thinking the thick fog was fun to run through. No one really understood the long-term health risks of inhaling the chemicals at the time. It seemed like just another summer activity, like riding bikes or playing tag, and parents didn't seem too concerned either.
Insecticide. Oh my days. And they would just allow them to do it. Okay, fair enough.
Trucks would roll slowly down the street, leaving a cloud behind, and kids would race through it, giggling and trying to stay in the fog as long as possible.
Jesus.
When winter came, one of the most daring things kids did back then was something called hooky bobbing.
I think you know what he was going to say. It's like when you're holding on to the back of like a car.
Which meant grabbing onto the back of a moving car.
Was this actually done though? Like, did kids actually do this? Is this the sort of thing that you sort of see in like films, but no one actually ever used to do it? Or was it quite a common sight that you would just see kids playing around doing stuff like this? Because if that's the case, then fair enough.
And sliding on the icy streets. It was like a makeshift sledding adventure, except the cars were real, and the ice was unpredictable. The goal was to hold on as long as you could without wiping out and getting hurt. There were many forms of this, some including a rope pulling a sled.
I've seen that with a rope, and people still do that, I think. And to be fair, if this is with your own car, maybe it's not as extreme. I was just sort of thinking kids holding onto random cars and then just doing this in like random streets. But I assume that would be a bit over the top, even for the 70s, but maybe not.
But it was the thrill of seeing how long you could hang on while the car sped away. This was especially popular on snow days, while kids were at home and needed fun things to keep them busy. Playing with fireworks was another exciting, though risky, part of being a kid in the 70s. Whether it was cherry bombs or bottle rockets, kids handled them with very little supervision, lighting them off in backyards for fun or trying to blow something up. Sometimes things didn't go quite as planned, with a black cat going off too soon or a bottle rocket shooting in the wrong direction. But that didn't stop kids from eagerly lighting the next fuse. Playing with small-scale explosives was exciting, especially for young boys during this relaxed era.
Bloody hell.
Neighborhood
fireworks.
games of football or street hockey in the 1970s were all about rough and tumble fun. Nobody wore pads or helmets, and injuries like scrapes, bruises, and the occasional broken bone were just part of being a kid. Full-contact sports were often expected, and everyone played to win. These games could get intense, and would often go on until the streetlights came on, with the kids settling their own disputes and handling whatever bumps and bruises came their way.
See, what if I'm mad about this, right? And obviously it makes sense. I understand that this would change over time because the health and safety of kids is important. But now, I don't even think it's just in the US now, but I think the US is the first country to stop allowing like kids under the age of like 13 or something from headering a football or a soccer ball. So now you can't do that as a kid in the US at all. But then 50 years back, 40 years back, you were doing stuff like this. It just shows how obviously, I guess, and again, it makes sense. I'm not saying it doesn't make sense because they've learned the science behind it. I guess the sports science and all that sort of stuff has helped people understand the issues it will cause for people's brains and stuff. But not even that far back, kids were getting up to all kinds of things without even any protection or anything. But I guess that's just how it is.
In the 1970s, it wasn't unusual to see kids riding bikes, skateboards, or scooters barefoot and shirtless. Summer afternoons were spent zooming down hills, wind in your hair, with nothing between you and the pavement. The risks were clear: cuts, stings, scrapes, and even rashes. But it wasn't something that kept kids from having as much fun as they could. Kids just weren't...
Bro, she is ballsy as hell. She looks like she can't be any more older than 7, 8 years old. And she's doing this on her bike. Fair enough.
concerned with covering up. After a rough scrape, Mom was always ready with the Bactine or mercurochrome, and had calamine lotion for things like poison ivy, which was everywhere at the time. And of course, there were always those Band-Aids from the metal tins. I mean, who could forget that Band-Aid jingle from the 1970s?
Depend on the protection of America's #1 bandage.
I am stuck on Band-Aid, 'cause Band-Aid stuck on me.
Let me know in the comments
What?
if I missed anything.
Oh, it's the classic socks.
And make sure to check the description of this video for links to pick up a t-shirt.
I guess that's the drip from the 70s. Those that grew up in the 60s to 80s, those that grew up in the 60s to 80s grew up in the sweet spot in history. Very grateful I was one of them. It was a blast. Going trick-or-treating in unfamiliar neighborhoods without adult supervision. I mean, to be fair, when I was like 11, 12, 13, do you trick-or-treat at 13? Probably like 10, 11, 12. Me and my friends would just go everywhere for trick-or-treating. Anywhere to get as many sweets as possible. So that was probably a thing when I grew up, but I guess it depends how old and yeah, if kids are still allowed to do it. I don't know. I didn't realise how tough we were in the 70s until I saw videos like this. It's facts. I mean, I'm looking at this stuff and I'm like, bro, this would not run obviously now, but I wouldn't even do some of this stuff myself at this age. Like, for example, the train tracks one. Sorry, that's a bit mad, I can't lie. The train tracks one. But hey, that's just part of the growing up process. The tyre one, I would not do that. The one at the what's the ride called? The spinny thing. What did he call it?
Climb onto the merry-go-round.
Merry-go-round. I mean, yeah, kids used them when I was growing up. I used them. But yeah, my door's ringing, so I'm going to end it here. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this reaction, and until next time, like, subscribe, and peace.